India has very categorically said that its stand is vindicated. Canadian Prime Minister has said that he had no proof, his government had no proof, something that India has been saying all along. And that's exactly what External Affairs Ministry spokesperson also said today in the briefing, where they said that this is exactly what New Delhi has been seeking. Give us proof so that we can act. It also says that the onus of the train wreck that the India-Canada relationship has now become is solely on Justin Trudeau. We come back. Let's first listen in to the External Affairs Ministry spokesperson. We come back and talk more on the impact the standoff is having on people, students, immigrants, all that. But first up, listen in to a formal reaction coming in from the External Affairs Ministry.
We chose to continue to work behind the scenes to try and get India to cooperate with us. And at that point, it was primarily intelligence, not hard evidentiary proof.
As far as the allegations are concerned, PM Trudeau's own admission yesterday would indicate the value. As regards our stance on the allegations, we will naturally reject false imputations against our diplomats. There's a clear pattern to smear India for reasons best known to them.
All right, let's discuss this in detail. I've got a panel of experts to talk about what this means in terms of the bilateral relationship and also the people-to-people impact. The students, tourists, a large number of Indians are in Canada right now, 17, 18 lakh of them. What happens to them in the backdrop of such uncertainty? We have Brahma Chilani, strategic affairs expert, joining me from Delhi, and we also have Terry Meluski, who's a former senior correspondent of CBC, joining me live from Toronto. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for taking out the time speaking to me on India Global. Terry, let me start with you. As things stand right now, New Delhi is very clear. Their stand has been vindicated. They've been saying all along there's no proof, and that's exactly what Justin Trudeau said as well.
Actually, he said that at the time there was only intelligence. That's number one. Number two, I'm not overwhelmed by not excited by the alleged difference between intelligence and evidence. If you've got good intelligence and you've got a picture of it and it's real, well, that's evidence. So I'm not impressed by that objection. There is a second problem on the Indian side. There's a problem, yes, on the Canadian side that they have failed to make it public. And of course, there are difficulties in Canadian law. The judge could throw the case out if he finds that politicians and prosecutors have been trying the accused in public, laying out evidence in public. That's putting a thumb on the scales of justice, influencing the trial. It's not kosher in law. So there are some limitations. But there are some problems on the Indian side. And I will mention one, just to be brief. That is that simultaneously, as it calls the Canadian allegations absurd, baseless, false, and reckless, at the same time, much the same allegations have been made by the Biden administration in the United States, which has leveled a very detailed and very persuasive indictment, chock full of hard evidence, against an Indian national, Nikhil Gupta, who's now awaiting trial. He's in prison in the United States, in New York. And he's facing trial on the charge that he, in cahoot with an Indian government official, plotted a murder plot to take out A, Gurpatwant Singh Pannu of Sikhs for Justice, and B, Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada. So it was one plot with at least two and several more targets. So how is one absurd, according to the Indians, and the other, which is the same plot, that they take very seriously? Now they have a high-level commission investigating it. Well, pick a lane. Either it's absurd or you're taking it seriously. You can't have both.
Okay. I want to fix that audio with Terry, and if we could just look at that because it's just a little erratic. But Mr. Chilani, respond to what Terry is saying, and in fact what many have been saying, though of course New Delhi has been very clear about the distinction between America and the Canadian probes, the fact that one has been completely professional about it, the fact that even when there are elections 3 weeks later, they've been absolutely professional with no political mudslinging happening. And that is exactly what's happening as far as Canada is concerned. But explain to us as far as what Terry is saying and how New Delhi should be responding to that.
First, Trudeau, by his own admission before the federal inquiry, has stated that in September 2023, when he triggered the downward spiral in bilateral relations with India by alleging an Indian government hand in the killing of a Sikh militant, at that stage, he did not have credible evidence against India. Now, that's an extraordinary admission for a person, for the leader of a government to have triggered this downward spiral in relations without having credible evidence. He was relying on raw intelligence, which was supplied to Canada by the Biden administration. As far as the American alleged plot is concerned, the Americans have shared with India technical, quote unquote, evidence like WhatsApp messages, which India is investigating. India is obligated to investigate if some country were to share some kind of evidence. The problem with Canada is that Canada till date has not shared any evidence with India. The Indian Ministry of External Affairs has been saying daily, it said it yesterday, it repeated today, that not an iota of evidence has been shared with India. Now, unless Canada shares that evidence with India, how can India set up any kind of inquiry? So that's the most important thing to bear in mind. But I think there's a larger issue here, that this kind of diplomatic spat between two major democracies is unprecedented. Never before have two major democracies squabbled over an issue that should have been discussed through diplomatic channels, resolved through diplomatic channels. Now, what has happened is that Trudeau, through his actions, he has not only crossed an Indian red line, he has virtually created a situation where normal diplomatic relations are not possible. Each country has expelled its senior diplomats, leaving only the middle and junior diplomats left in each mission.
Then let me then ask you this in terms of what happens to the people. That's an issue that I want to address, and let's get in those graphics as well for our viewers to see in terms of the kind of impact this will have, whether it is in terms of trade, whether it's in terms of students. There you can see about 1.3 million students are in Canada in the last 9 odd years. About 320,000 Indians out of 800,000 international students. So they are a fair bit of number, and in fact 30.9 billion has been added to Canada's GDP just by Indian students alone. So that is the impact on one aspect. Then there is tourism. We're going to keep playing those, but that's something I want to ask Brahmacharani to you and then get in Terry as well, that India from a people to people connect has a very high exposure to Canada, whether it is in terms of students, those seeking PR or those wanting to go and meet their family and relatives. What about the uncertainty and how it's impacting these people, these segments?
Two things have to be kept in mind. That first, Canada enjoys a trade surplus with India, and Canada's universities depend on Indian students for sustenance. That the Indian students are the cash cow of Canadian universities. So Canada needs India, but India also needs Canada. And the challenge for both Ottawa and New Delhi is how to salvage this relationship by addressing the core concerns. The core concerns are about the fact that Canada has become the global hub of the Khalistani militant movement. It's history is repeating itself. What happened in the first half of the 1980s, which led to twin Air India bombings of 1985, in which 331 people were killed by Sikh terrorist bombers, according to 2 separate Canadian inquiries. That same scenario is now unfolding, not in terms of the bombings, but the threat of something similar happening, because Canada has now become the international epicenter of the Khalistani terrorist movement. These people are using Canadian soil to openly threaten India. They are glorifying the assassination of Indira Gandhi, and now they're threatening to kill the incumbent Prime Minister of India, Modi. So this is happening from Canadian soil. This is
Yes.
unacceptable.
Yes.
And therefore, it's incumbent on both countries to find a
to
way
resolve
out
some of these
and
issues.
let
Absolutely.
me
Mr.
just add
Chilani,
one
let me
line.
get Terry's response to that. His audio has been fixed. Terry, respond to what we have been also talking about in terms of the people-to-people connect and the impact that citizens will have of a diplomatic standoff that to a large extent is Justin Trudeau's making.
I think the large number of citizens who depend, of both countries who depend on this relationship flourishing will have to begin putting pressure on both governments to settle this in a civilized way. I would like to add that on the point just made, that I'm completely sympathetic to Indian anger and disgust over the 40 years of complacency and toleration of Khalistani threats and actual violence over the years. It's been absolutely appalling the way that Canadian politicians, not just the Liberals, by the way, but all parties, have bent the knee, have shown up at Vaisakhi Day parades, celebrating the Air India bomber as a great hero. And the politicians go and smile and wave and hustle for votes. Oh, what posters of Indapama? What posters of the mass murder? Oh, I didn't see those. I'm so surprised to hear they were there. They pretend that they don't know what they're doing. Well, they are pandering to a terrorist movement. And by the way, it's a very small minority of seats in Canada that support that movement. So Canada is definitely to blame for the growth in Indian anger, maybe even causing India to, well, if you won't do anything about it, you will. However, India has miscalculated that this is a free speech country in Canada, and we're not going to just ban everybody who says Khalistan Zindabad. That's not against the law in Canada, and it's not going to be. India should forget the idea. They just say, well, Parpam Singh Panoon is a designated terrorist. We say he's a terrorist. Therefore, you should treat him as a terrorist.
Okay.
What's the evidence? And so there's a problem there, but it's not insoluble, my point. And I think that the students and the other citizens that you mentioned already, these people could and should say to their government of all parties,
Okay.
look, you've got to settle this. We need a civilized relationship between two important democracies.
Absolutely. We need a civilized relationship between two democracies. But at the end of the day, as I said, there are two sides to this. One is the diplomatic standoff, where India says its stand has been completely vindicated. And then there is the other side about the human impact of this, that at the end of the day, we may be running several universities. We may be ensuring that Canada runs a trade surplus against us. But what happens to those who are in queue for the opportunities that they had lined up for, whether it's students, tourists, or family, or those seeking PR permits and so on and so forth? That's a story we're going to come back and revisit. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for taking out the time and speaking to me on India Global.